Okay, so let's get this started. I think we are ready and we can get this show started. Thank you everybody for being here to Ask the Expert. Our Family and Community Engagement Department has been bringing you these virtual sessions every week with amazing people, with amazing leaders in our CPS district, right? School district. Gracias a todos. My name is Maria Munoz. I am the FACE specialist for Network 8. You usually see my colleague Berenice, but you will see me and Cristina Carreto as well. We are all FACE specialists and we're all here to support you and lead these sessions. So thank you so much for spending your Thursday here with us. We're excited to have everybody here and we're excited to hear our presenters. I'm just gonna do a couple of housekeeping rules that we have here. So just to make sure this session will be completely recorded, we want to ensure that this knowledge will be shared with the parents who are not able to be here today. You can also see previous sessions if you haven't been in this one or this is your first one, you can see the other ones in our YouTube channel. We'll be sharing that in the chat and we will also be sending that through email. We will have a short presentation followed by a conversation with Dr. Swinney and Chief Howell with questions submitted ahead of time by participants who had been RSVPing. So we'll do our best to get all those questions, but if we don't, we'll make sure to email you the answers as well. Just give us a couple of days to ensure that we get those answers to you. We will open the chat function 15 minutes before the end of the meeting to allow participants to type additional questions, but please keep them in mind throughout the presentation so you can have them ready. We might not get them all, but again, we will have them saved in our chat and we'll be able to answer them and send them through an email to everyone who's been here today. So in today's Ask the Expert, we have leading with equity during a pandemic. It's something that we all are, thinking about, especially if you're a parent of a CPS student. I am personally a parent of a CPS student, and I want to make sure that, my kid also gets that education, that amazing education that everybody wants here in the city of Chicago. But before we get into talk and chat with our presenters, I want to make sure that you guys know that we have several other experts who are going to come in and who are going to be talking about major topics throughout the month of April. Just a side note, next week, since it's spring break, we will not be having this session. But please don't worry, we'll make sure to send an email with all this information so you're able to get the links and you're able to RSVP for the following sessions that we have in April. And all right, let's get this started officially with Dr. Swinney and Chief Howell. I will want you guys to introduce yourselves and tell us all those amazing things that you guys have been doing, not only throughout your professional life, but here in the city of Chicago. Welcome and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Maria. I appreciate you and the FACE team for putting all of this together for us. I am also learning from other members of the CPS leadership team. I interact with them a lot, but these presentations have also been insightful for me to keep my eye on the pulse of equity throughout Chicago Public Schools. I'm celebrating my 20th year in public education, and I'm actually at the high school where I was a principal. My team and I have had a retreat for the last couple of days, one of the first times we've been together within a year. And while I'm visiting the school today, the seniors they are the last freshman class that I had before I became Chief Equity Officer. They were here today. And so it was a real full circle moment for me to spend some time with them, to say hello and just ask them about their own future aspirations. Even through all of the pandemic, they have been persistent about making sure that they have the right grades and have the right success so they can go on and think about what's the next stage of their lives. So I'm having a great day. Happy Thursday to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Just really quickly, former principal. Before that, I was an assistant principal, instructional coach, and English teacher. So I started in 2001. And happy to share some thoughts and ideas around leading for equity during the pandemic, centering on what is CPS doing. I think you know a little bit about what we have done in terms of feeding, families, and Chicago Public Schools playing a central part in supporting families with meals and having supportive technology, and also the Chicago Connected program of making sure that people have Wi-Fi access. But that's only the beginning now that we have some changes within the city in terms of vaccination and with care funds. So I'll dig more into that later, but I want to transfer it to Chief Howell to introduce himself as well.
Thank you so much.
Bienvenido a todos. Uh-oh, sorry about that.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Bienvenido a todos. Me llamo Bing Howell. Greetings, everyone. My name is Bing Howell. I'm the Chief Portfolio Officer for CPS. What that means in short is this is a newly created office. It was created about a little less than a year and a half ago when I got here. And it's largely to solve something that I think is at the core of the question that we're answering today. How can we make sure that every student has access to a high quality education? That's what we're here for as a district. And the reality is I can be honest, like one of the reasons why I feel really proud to be working at this district and why I feel really lucky to be on this phone with you all is there's a number of things that we're doing really, really well. We've actually seen as a major school district, we're actually one of the best at being able to grow our students educationally, to just escalate their learning. But the reality is we know that's not the same everywhere in the city. And the reality is we know that that needs to be the same everywhere in the city. We also know that the rub that makes this conversation really challenging, the equity conversation, is really grounded in a lot of things that are inherent with our city, with our country, with our history. It's racism. It's the institutional challenges that exist because of it. And being able to tear all those apart are part of what make these challenges these conversations really challenging. As Chief Swinney and myself were reading through the questions, like, well, why can't my student have access to this and this and this? Like, a lot of it is actually rooted in a number of those challenges that we actually are working diligently to make sure that we are rectifying. And so the portfolio office is in place largely because we know that not every student has access to those same types of opportunities. And we know that we need to take the barriers down so that every student can do what we all know and believe that each one of our kids can do. Achieve. And so with that being said, I also want to highlight I'm a proud half Panamanian. My mom is from the Canal Zone. I'm a first generation American myself, and really, really excited to be able to dig into, and actually learn a lot from you all on what we need to do to make sure that we're more responsive to getting our kids and your kids where they need to be. So we're going to share a little and we're going to listen a heck of a lot, but I want to pass it over to Dr. Swinney to sort of frame some of our combo.
Thank you so much for both of you guys for being here. It's an amazing trajectory that you guys have. Your professionalism is amazing and inspiring. So I will help you guys with the presentation, correct? Yes. So let me stop this part right here and get you guys started with your presentation. Thank you so much for sending it to me. And I will just
thank you for supporting us in presenting. I'm excited because this conversation around equity and opportunity is one that we've all been wanting to have for a while. And so with this essential question around how is CPS leading for equity during the pandemic, today Chief Howell and I will explore what we call opportunity indexing. And I'm going to explain what all of that sort of fancy language means. Essentially, we're figuring out what does it take to get students what they need? And how do we think about those who are farthest from opportunity and considering the right sort of moves within the district and resource allocations and designs to really help us do that. The image you see on the screen is very clear about equity. The bottom image provides young people what they need, where the height, accessibility needs, that is what we're trying to figure out when we talk about opportunity indexing. Next slide. So here are our meeting objectives to understand like what is the opportunity index, to garner some feedback, and then to show some of the prototypes that we have. And let me make one Slight change, Maria. I am going to make sure I have sent you the updated version. I just G-chatted it, not G-chatted it, Zoom chatted it to you. I think we made some tweaks, so I'm not sure if my team sent that version, but I wanted to make sure. What I went back and did, honestly, is I looked at the questions that some people were having, and I wanted to make sure that we were responsive to the questions as we built a presentation. So once we sat down and really organized around what are most concerns for people, we took a moment to take a step back and say, let's reorder the presentation with that in mind. So that's my apology. So thank you for making that switch.
No, thank you for being so conscious about it. We appreciate you.
One of the first person who comes to mind was Ruth from Sutherland, who asked, what does equity mean to you? And I'll talk a little bit about what it means for us as Chicago Public Schools and what it means for me personally. First, equity defines as championing, which is getting behind young people around the individual cultures, identities, talents, abilities, languages, everything that makes a student unique. It is our job to ensure that they receive the right and the necessary resources and opportunity to meet their unique needs and aspirations. Needs are developmental. Needs can be social. Aspirations are about what do young people see for themselves? What do they want for their own futures? And how do we pay attention to all of that information to support those efforts? I will also add to that, part of equity that's written in the CPS, the long version of the CPS equity definition, is that we have to correct some historical wrongs and we have to prioritize people who have been historically underserved. We have to make sure that we're checking our systems and our processes for bias and racism and all the other things that Chief Howell talked about that get in the way of ensuring that young people have a high quality education in our schools. Next slide. I added this image a few minutes ago because I want to sort of take a step back and think about what does it mean to think about opportunity. Our central core belief or strategy in the CPS equity framework is targeted universalism, which essentially says, how do you get all of the young people to the goal? When you look at the image on the left, you'll notice that green line. That green line is where we want everyone to be. And like Chief Howell says, you know, we know that we're not set up in a way that gets every student what they need. So the question is, what do we need to interrupt? And what resources do we need to put under people or provide to people to get everyone to the goal? And that's the bigger strategy for us as an organization, getting young people to the goal of having a solid, high quality education that we talk about in our CPS 5-year vision. Next slide. Roberto. So Roberto, I feel like I've seen you in so many meetings and conversations, so I'm hoping you're part of the participation crew that we, based on that number I see at the bottom for participants. The question was like, how is it CPS ensuring that every school in every neighborhood are fostering and strengthening their equity program? What we did when we launched the CPS equity framework back, the draft of it in spring 2019, was move around to all principles, because the first step of really talking about what equity is really making sure that we all have a common definition. And so that's why we provided the framework and tons of tools that anyone can find on at equity.cps.edu. I'll drop that in the chat later. But a part of every school is tackling equity different. Some schools are looking at their grading policies. Other schools are looking at how do they create a sense of belonging in their school culture for all young people. Some schools have started equity teams. And so what we've done so far is provide resources to schools, to administrators, to teachers who are interested in really driving equity within their school. We will say the order of the framework itself helps to situate how a school can sort of move through equity. And soon, at some point, you'll hear more about some partnerships that we have that I'm not telling anyone about yet to help some schools get further along. Next slide. So at the core of opportunity, we know we have to talk about resource allocation and resource equity. The definition for resource equity that's written into our framework is essentially say, how do we create equitable student experiences and learning ready environments? Meaning, how do we ensure that every school in every school has what they need? How do we ensure that the right programs and supports, people, time, and money are there to support young people to have a successful school experience? The best way to do that is to organize around data to figure out who has what need, what resources do we have, and how do we be streamlined and focused on getting the resources to those young people who need it. Before I transfer it over to Bing, I want to share one more thing. Next slide. We've talked a lot about opportunity indexing in our budget. I'm sure some of you have heard about our CPS Equity Grants that we've supported schools who've had lower enrollment or under-enrolled schools to make sure that they can hold their basic academic program. What we used to make those decisions were the UIC Economic Hardship Index, because we know, as Chief Howell mentioned earlier, structural racism is a very old thing, and it continues to impact the way in which young people in their communities and their families are having certain experiences. We know that some communities have been historically underserved. And so what we did was we worked really to say, how do we take this information about unemployment, education, and poverty and crowded housing to really make some decisions on where we as an organization need to put money behind. And so what we found is there is an alignment between community outcomes, which is to no fault of the community. I want to also make that clear, that we're not using information to blame communities for the conditions. We can see where historical disinvestment has occurred, and what we're trying to do with the opportunity index and all of these equity indexing is to correct those historical wrongs. So before that, before I get into our opportunity index itself, I want to transfer it over to Chief Howell, who will help us to understand the sort of the racial makeup of our city, which I'm sure many of you know, and help us to think about opportunity mapping. So before we explain every little thing about the opportunity index, we want to sort of give a broad scope overview around where things are right now within our city. Chief Howell.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Swinney. If we can go to the next slide. So what this picture is showing us is something that everyone on this call is very aware of. We live in an extremely segregated city. And so as you see, there are certain networks that have more Latino, Latina, Latinx folks. There's certain neighborhoods that have more African Americans. That's just the way our city's constructed. As a micro, if we are saying, for example, hey, we want to make sure that we have equal distribution of English language learner teachers, instructors across the entire district, that wouldn't make sure that network 7, network 8, network 14 that have significantly more English language learners have the translators they need and have the educators they need who can actually speak their language, understand their background, et cetera. So really being able to be transparent about, here are the students who are Latinx, for example, who actually have language needs, and being able to be this transparent about here's what the needs are enables us to get to some of those more equitable solutions. So we need to be transparent about the challenge, the opportunity, and the resources necessary to get to where we need to go. If we go to the next slide. One of the questions that was posed was by a señorita Martinez, a parent from Berry Elementary. And she was asking, the question is, why does my child's school have fewer academic resources compared to other schools? Frankly, that is a question that I've heard a lot since I've been here. And frankly, it's one of the most challenging questions that I think we face as a district overall. Some of it has to do with national trends. Some of it has to do with local trends. But regardless of what, it's a challenge that we actually have to face. On a macro, the reality is that population of larger cities that are not in the South of cities have actually been shrinking. Birth rates have been shrinking. Cities that actually have lots of large immigrant populations have actually shrunk. At that same time, places that are more expensive, like Chicago, have had shrinking populations with folks moving further south to Indiana, for example. There's certain areas of the city that are growing in the north, and a lot of the populations in the south and the west are actually shrinking. And so what that's translating into is actually over the past 15 years, we've had over 100,000 students leave the district. Operationally, that translates into a number of schools that don't have all the students. And more students translate to schools being able to have access to more resources. This is a very real challenge. It's at the core of the realities that Dr. Swinney was identifying earlier. If you're in a school that actually needs to have access to more students equal more resources equal all the types of experiences we know and want our kids to have. And a number of schools, we need to figure out how to solve for that. We're getting better at it, but we're not close to where we need to be right now. And getting to those solutions is one of the reasons why you're consistently going to be hearing more from us and actually even providing more feedback to us, because we need to get to that solution together. But the challenge that I just highlighted is at the core of the challenge that we're solving for. If we go to the next slide. This slide very much aligns and it highlights essentially the nature of actually how we hope to engage, how we need to engage to get to the realities that Dr. Swinney is talking about. Out of the equity framework, we have our spectrum of inclusive partnerships, which starts with just being able to listen. But at the very end, it takes us all the way towards the end of really being able to sit down in partnership with those most impacted, meaning you parents on this call, and being able to identify how we are co-creating solutions together and building plans that are going to get our kids, your kids, our kids to where they need to go together. And so this picture is a spectrum. And one of the reasons why for anyone on this call who's actually said, hey, there are lots of budget meetings, there are accountability meetings in SQRP, there are facility meetings, and we're actually seeing more and more of these. It's largely because of this picture. Once again, going back to the very beginning, what got us here won't get us there. And part of the next frontier for our level of being able to best support our kids and families is being able to co-construct these realities, these futures, these goals and these dreams with you. So if we go to the next slide. This is just a picture, oversimplification of like what the embodiment of that looks like. Making sure that we actually have conversations where we're saying, hey parents, you are the person who knows your student the best. What does this equitable reality really need to look like? But also making sure the principal who's leading that school is also around that same table, and the teacher that's actually in the homeroom classroom with them every day is helping to shape that. And by the way, the after-school partner who's actually supporting them after the school bell rings at 3 o'clock. It's only when we have the table set with all those people around will we really be able to get the full answer to how can we make sure your student has all the things they need to get to the great future that we all envision for them having. So there will continue to be more meetings. Your feedback will continue to shape the work that we're doing even more, because we do realize and we know that the only way to get there is together. So with that being said, I do want to hand it back over to Chief Swinney, who will be able to go deeper into the index tool itself.
Thanks, Chief. To Chief Howell's point, this is one of the first times I think that we will engage families around, to his point, around lots of things. And what the Opportunity Index is designed to do is to make sure that we are responding in a way that uses data in a positive manner to support opportunity for young people in the future. Next slide. So the question becomes, click one more time, please, is what is all of this opportunity indexing? And I want you to sort of think about a supercomputer. For some of us, we might think of a supercomputer as like the size of a school. I'm exaggerating. Or we might think of a computer that holds a lot of information. Essentially, what an opportunity index does is it takes a lot of factors that we know exist put them into one sort of bank of information and gives us a number. And that number is helpful in helping us determine how do we respond to where specific needs are, whether we're talking about whole school, whole community needs, or we're talking about specific populations within the school, those critical needs. And I'll show you some other visuals in a second that describe that. In this opportunity index, there are several what I'm going to call indicators or data points that we've worked with some researchers and learning from UIC, those folks who created the Economic Hardship Index, and also work with some other organizations like the Kerwin Institute in Ohio, people who do this sort of data design work for a living to make sure that everything that we do is responding to where young people go to school and responding to where they live. So there are two sort of critical factors built into the opportunity index. What is a person's school life? Like, is a person traveling from one place to another out of their community to go to a school? How do we make sure that dollars follow young people that have critical needs to support their in-school experience? And how do we think of communities that have been historically underserved? So when we look at the factors on in the columns, you'll see community factors. So we take in community hardship, meaning we know that there's some rights, some wrongs that need to be corrected. If the student resides in the Invest Southwest area, so how do we think about certain communities like our North Lawndale community, for example, where the mayor has had some conversations and put some stakes in the ground around, we have to do some community revitalization efforts. And also community life expectancy index. We know that some I'll give you one example of what that looks like. Those who live in Hyde Park, which is adjacent to those who live in Washington Park, have different life expectancy rates by 20 years to some degree. That means you can live in Washington Park and you're expected to live 20 years less than those who live in Hyde Park. So we need to pay attention to that in terms of as a school system of where we are driving resources into specific areas. We also take into account student demographic information. What's the percentage of diverse learners in your school? How many students receive free and reduced lunch? What's our English language learner population size? Do we have some students who are eligible but not enrolled in Medicaid? How many students are in temporary living situations or homeless? The percentage of teachers retained, like the number of teachers who stay at a particular school for a number of years, or and the percentage of students of color within that building. So we take all of that information and then also some historical funding information. Two things: where have we invested money in the school buildings, whether we're building buildings or investing any part of the capital budget. And then there's another green line that you can't see right below that just talks about what has been the historical funding for a particular school or community. So essentially we take all of those data points, put them in the system, or like I like to cook. So if I were to sort of put all these ingredients into a pot, it would give me something. And so what it gives me is a number. Next slide. So I'm going to talk through this slide. I apologize if I talk a little bit slower for this one, but I want you to take a moment and I want you to look at school A. Just look all the way across. You'll see a dark green area where it says Equity Index Subscore. I'm going to talk about that opportunity score in a moment. And then when you look further all the way to the end where there's a darker blue, you see another number. So 1.6 and 1.8. Click again, please. Now notice school E. 4.0 and 3.5. Click once more. Now pay attention to this sort of light or lime green area. Here's what I notice and that how the opportunity index will be helpful for us. Where you see school A, 1.6, that means that school has less need compared to other schools. Meaning there might be ways in which that school has additional dollars. It might be certain programs, it might be certain student populations. We're not taking into account that. What we're figuring out is, or we are taking into account certain percentages of where we know there is documented need and support. And when you look at school E, you see a 4.0, which means that school has more need than the school that has 1.6. So for us as a district, we have to be very thoughtful about what does it mean to support a school that has a 4.0 in terms of the need and a school that has a 1.6. Another way to think about that is if a school has a higher opportunity score, that means we have to be thinking about the whole school as a population. And when you look at a school A that has a 1.6, there could be specific student groups within that school. So you can have a school that has less need, but there's a certain population, like our EL population, our LGBTQ population, diverse learners. Like we have to pay attention to which student groups are farthest from opportunity and how do we support them. So that's kind of the short version of the opportunity index. And in a second, I'll talk about what we plan to do with it. The other section in the blue, this other green section says, I'll use this as an example. If the Department of Literacy calls me one day and says, Maurice, we have some resources, some teachers, some teacher professional learning, some books and things that we would like to support schools with. They're going to ask me for an opportunity score. And I might say, here are some opportunity scores. But based on that resource, what other factors would help you to know if you should put that resource into that school? So they might say, let's add in the percentage of students who are reading on grade level. Let's add in schools that have functional libraries and librarians assigned to their school. They might say, let's add in teachers who have certified reading backgrounds. They give us all those additional factors to come up with the score to say, here are places to do more critical investment. And that's what we say as an Office of Equity. If we're going to drive resource equity in partnership with the portfolio team, with the portfolio office, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to who has what need and where does it go. That's the whole system. And then over time, we get to track the success of what we're doing. Next slide. One version of that that many of you probably have seen before is with our capital budget from our last year. And this capital budget equity index was informed by community. So last spring, almost a year, and these conversations are coming up again, we asked folks in the middle of this pandemic, what do we need to pay attention to in order to support schools and communities with funding? And they gave us feedback on these factors, and we added some based on their feedback. We're going to test this same equity index with the capital budget this year to continue on that learning so we can have 2 years of data to see, are we making the right decisions around the capital budget? And the good thing about an opportunity index, for example, which is even larger than this capital index right here, is that it helps us to think about the district as a whole and how do we be very clear about where people, where time, where money goes, even as we think about you know, the CARES Act funds and all of that fun stuff. Next slide. One of the questions that I didn't, that I meant to respond to on the previous slide is the question from Zach was, what factors are way more heavily than others? In the equity index, we will eventually have a report that says the methodology and explains how everything is weighted. We're in the middle of working with some researchers to test all of our data to make sure it's solid, and then to deeply explain the methodology. And what we want to do with this index is begin to use it and talk with communities around the city for us to think about what does it mean to drive opportunity. So I'll pause there. And I know we have some questions in the chat. These questions I put on the screen when the chat is made available to you, I just want to allow people to, you know, what is the adult mindset work that we need to do to address, in CPS and within our city. So as we talk about opportunity indexing, we know that some people will feel uncomfortable with talking about resources. What might we need to say and help people to understand about resource allocation? That's a real question. And so any insights that anyone will want to provide in the chat when it's open, you should feel free to do that. Who should we bring to the table as we continue to iterate on resource equity? Like, are there specific people or organizations that you would say, Maurice, you should really talk to XYZ, or talk to these community-based organizations, or talk to these folks because there's some voices that we need to hear and bring to the table about how to really do this work well? And are there some policies that we need to pay attention to as well? So I'm open to any sort of feedback, to Chief Howell's point in the beginning about really getting feedback from folks. This is one of multiple opportunities, but we think there is always a space for us to learn and to grow. So I will stop there. And how do you want us to proceed, Maria? Do we go through questions in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A? I can pull that up as well.
Of course, I have a question here in regards to teachers, and I'll start answering, asking you guys these questions while people start typing in the chat. And I see some of the questions are starting to come in the chat. So if the chat can be open so they can start typing those up, that would be great. But one question that I have here is, how is the district supporting teachers who need more comprehensive equity training, not optional for workshops?
Yeah, let me say that is something we're figuring out as we work on our Skyline curriculum project. What we have been in discussions around is there was like the anti-racist, anti-bias learning. There's a culturally responsive education piece. There is supporting students through wellness. And so what the Office of Teaching and Learning, the Office of Equity, and the Social Emotional Learning offices are coordinating around is, what does that professional learning opportunity look like? And how do we be more systematic so that we're not overtaxing teachers with, here's all these PDs, but really think about what it means to streamline supports. So there's no solid answer, but I can tell you it's on the radar of something that we are paying attention to.
Thank you. And that question was by Adina Linker from CIS of Chicago. I apologize for not mentioning the name before, but we try to do it so you guys know that we're answering your questions that are being given to us through the RSVP process. And as Dr. Swinney and Chief Howell, they were answering these questions as they went on with the presentation. So we appreciate that. We appreciate the extra input. And I did notice that you translated your presentation as well, which is awesome to see that too. Thank you. And there's this questions too from Gerald Liu. And it says, if CPS magically received the amount of funding necessary to educate an average student in the district, how would you distribute those funds? What efficiencies have not been tackled within the district to make sure more dollars are used for those students?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So here is something that I think we do a bad job with expressing as a district. When you look at, and I'll use my former school, Tilden, as an example. The reason why we say resource equity is people, time, and money, because technically right now, more money is spent per student at a small school like Tilden. And I am telling you because I looked at those numbers myself. So the question becomes, what are we really solving for in the student experience? And how do we put the right resources and opportunity or situate young people within the right resources and opportunity? And that's why Chief Howell and I are partnering on these efforts to make sure that when we talk about students having a full, well-rounded experience in school, that we're paying attention to resources, programmatic design, like the ARA, and all those elements that really help to make a robust education happen. So in other words, and the other part of that is not all dollars will, there's a way to spend dollars to get to a need. And to some degree, it's like, how do you provide more money to school, but also how do you provide the right resources, program, professional learning, all of those elements. There's a group called, if you put in ERS resource equity, you'll get a document that pops up that explains what composes a high quality school experience. And to Gerald's other question around teacher retention, the reason why we included that number is because we know when we talk about proxy measures or leading indicators, what helps us to know if a student will read on grade level, it's having a consistent, strong teacher. And what we find is that in some schools where there are critical needs, some of our young people are not having teachers in front of them, and we have to look at our policies and the way we invest in schools to figure that out consistently.
And I would like, so first off, thank you for that, Chief Swinney. Gerald, thanks for the question. I want to answer that. It'll get to the same place, but in a different way. So the question that was shared earlier by Ms. Martinez and her experience. Ms. Martinez, the reality is there is a number of things that you know you want your student to have that equate to a high quality experience. I don't know you well enough to know what those things are, but you have a clear picture that when your child goes to school, they need to be doing these things. And it's not just English, math. There's a certain level of arts and extracurriculars and what she's spending, your child, he or she, or they are spending their time doing that you envision. And we need to make sure that each one of our kids has that same opportunity and that it's not more in one area versus the other. And so regardless of what is a school district, we need to get to a point where we know that every student is having that same high quality level of expectation that we all want for our kids. And it's not just in that area or in higher likelihoods in that area. And so at a core, the first place we would spend resources is to make sure that everybody has that. And then on top of that, like we'd actually have to make sure that the students that are furthest from it, that actually have the most challenges in actually getting to that point, have access to it. I.e., if English is your second language, then the reality is it will take additional resources to fully take advantage of that same opportunity. So chances are there would be more dollars associated with that student. If you're in a neighborhood that doesn't have access to all of the parks and experiences that other neighborhoods, then if that was part of the core experience, then we want to make sure that students had access to that too, and there would be an additional dollar sign associated with that. And so all of that experience bunched in together, a lot of that is actually what's tracked, what is collected in the equity index. Like what are all the things, what are all the different layers that equate to students having different realities that keep them further and further away from what that core experience really is, so that we can make sure we're getting that to them. That's what we're really solving for.
Thank you so much for that. And I see a question here, and as a mom as well, I want to also know how are students being involved, right? So this question says, what is being done to intentionally bring students into this conversation? And any of you can start answering.
I'm hiring an equity program manager to help me to strongly connect with young people. I know it sounds like a position, but right now I need somebody to hold space whose job is it to engage young people and mentorship and partner with Heather, who is a fantastic leader in CPS, who is director of the Office of Social Science and Civic Engagement, and with Dr. Miguel Saucedo, who is a part of our mentorship work. There are some groups that I want to engage, particularly in Chicago, those who have been protesting, who have been raising their beautiful voices to push us as a district. But right now I need a person to help hold space for that so that we have ongoing interaction. I will say I could describe some of the minimal ways in which we've connected with MICFA Challenge, and we've been partnering with other scopes of work on student voice, but we have not done that with opportunity indexing. This is the first time that I feel like the index and design is in a good place that helps us to iterate. So that's a great question. It's a great push, and you should stay tuned. Thank you.
I think one of the other things that we're doing more of, and we need to continue to do more of, is in those conversations that we were highlighting earlier, making sure that students are there. Students are around the table shaping the decisions, and students are actually providing feedback when we're collecting it as well. I could say right now, for example, with the redesign that we're doing around our school accountability process, we have students around the table. And students are telling us this is what matters, this is what doesn't, and that's really helping us shape it. Now, once again, even though that's where we're at right now, we need to do a heck of a lot better and a lot more of it. But extending the table to make sure, once again, as Chief Swinney was highlighting, those most impacted, i.e. students, are actually helping us to shape the answers. That's a really, really meaningful part of it.
I noticed, Ruth, let me tell you, what you described here is a very complex idea. where it says we need to be intentional with our vocabulary, not seeing students as having less or more need, just different. I will say in some cases, we do have to distinguish less or more, because when we look at structural racism, certain people have been locked out of systems. Certain people have been locked out of opportunities. So one of the reasons why we, in writing our CPS equity definition, that the reason why it's so wordy, to talk about necessary resources and opportunity or unique needs and aspirations, is because we do know that students who have experienced trauma have more need, and we got to be responsive to that and think about how do we get the right clinicians, how do we disrupt poverty, how do we ensure young people are not being pushed out. Like, all of those things are very, very complex that we want to pay attention to. But I can tell you what we are not intending to do, and we will continue to refine, is not make it seem like there's something wrong with the child. I think that's kind of what you're getting at. So we'll keep perfecting that language, but thank you for that call out.
Thank you so much, guys, for answering all these questions. This is amazing feedback from our stakeholders and hearing from the equity department as well, and the portfolio department. And I have a question here in Spanish, and I would like to translate it for you guys. So this is coming from Presencia, and I'll read it in Spanish. ¿Cómo se van a asegurar que ustedes, que los sustitutos de salones de clase estén capacitados para estar en salón? So pretty much is saying, how are we going to ensure that the substitutes that are being placed in our classrooms are going to be, you know, qualified to be in those classrooms? How are we ensuring that they're qualified?
I wish I could give you a better answer. I do know between the Office of Talent and the Office of, I think, Diverse Learner Services and Supports, there's something being worked on. I would be lying if I told you I knew. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer to that question.
Yeah, I don't have access to an answer either. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much for your honesty and vulnerability, right? To show this, that sometimes not everybody has the answers, right? We are now at around 4:52. We probably have one, if we can answer one more question, maybe.
I'm here at 5 o'clock, so you can keep it rolling.
Right? No, that's true. That's very true. Just make sure to know, everyone, we do have the chat open if you want to continue asking those questions there. And Dr. Swinney and Chief, you guys have been great at answering everything that I guess we're speechless at all of the information you're giving us. So thank you so much.
With the follow-up to the follow-up. So
yes,
you know, I see some folks who show up often, and so it'll be good for us to also to just keep connecting with you all. And as you heard some of these things, if you email us at equity or email, I can take the emails from Chief Howell and me, but equity@cps.edu. Like, one of the ideas we're talking about is on the equity team is, I'm gonna call it an equity index tour, which sounds, I'm not trying to sensationalize it, but how do we go around to different community groups and meetings where we know people are, not expecting always for people to come to us, but there might be, you know, I don't know, community organizations that might say, hey, we have a group of parents who are interested in knowing this. So we do want to start to move out a little bit. So I'm open to some ideas around that. I know there's also a concern around time. I don't want to overcommit, but I think there are some ways in which, you know, as the world is opening up a little more, that we have to figure out how to connect with people who we don't hear from often and who deserve to be heard.
Exactly. And I think this goes along with what Nicole is stating in the chat, right? Like, what is your office doing? Thinking around the role of friends of groups that are playing and perpetuating and reinforcing inequities across the district.
Yeah, I think this is an ongoing, I think I was probably tagged in something. If Miriam, I think Miriam, I read something the other day on Twitter. I have not taken my eyes off of this, is what I'll tell you in this conversation. I do think there is something we got to pay attention to and understand about friends of, and I have not taken my eyes off of that.
So I don't have an answer to that question specifically, but I do want to talk a bit about what I think is at the core of some of this. And at the core of it is it's the equity conversation. students who have the most needs should actually have access to the most resources, and this is antithetical to that. And it exacerbates that. And so like when I sort of think about, you know, the resource equity that Dr. Swinney has been talking about, I think about it at a number of levels. Like one, we have a set pie and our pie needs to be bigger, right? It's already been identified, the reality that like we are at a district level, we are funded at the rate of 66% of what we should be funded. There's a huge, huge gap. And so the reality is we need to continue as a system to advocate for more and more, because regardless of what, our kids need more resources, not less, and you can't cover up that large of a gap. Now, with that being said, the reality is while we're doing that, we need to continue to have the conversations and do the work in the space with the resources that we actually do have. And once again, that ties back to the equity index. How do we make sure that the students who have who need the resources the most are actually able to get it? And so whereas like there's the per pupil allocation, like where we have access to discretionary resources, disproportionately ensuring that those actually align with the students who have access to the most need. And as a district and as district leaders, that's something that you all need to continue to hold us accountable to. That's what we're doing right now.
Thank you so much, Chief Howell. And to respect everyone's time, we are all coming to an end. We appreciate your time. We appreciate all the questions that are being shared. We are going to make sure to copy all these questions, continue answering them. And everybody who showed up today, we'll be emailing you and trying to answer all those questions that you guys have. But before we end, you guys, yeah.
Everyone, I feel like I've seen Elizabeth Nolan's question come up twice, and I think I might have just.
Oh, yeah, sure.
It says, for the record, per pupil funding is an equity issue. Yes. The opportunity index, we hope is, not hope, I think there are some ways to solve for that, short-term and long-term. Schools that lose enrollment. Yeah, I think so. When Chief Howell talked about like people moving out of the city and communities being historically disinvested or underserved, I think all of that has contributed to population loss. So that's important. But it says, how are these? So when we talk about community hardship, when it says how are those issues accounted for in the equity index, community hardship takes into account that historically underserved part. And then when at the bottom of the, at one of the other community factors, when we talked about Invest Southwest as being an important factor, Invest Southwest areas that have been designated, we want to align some of our strategies within the district with that, so there is compound investment. Chief, I don't know if I'm saying the right terms of compound investment, but how do we partner on with the city on making sure that we're driving resources into certain communities, and that's how it's accommodated within the index.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's great to clear it up now that we're here, that we have you guys, and ensuring that we're respecting everyone who's conversating with us through the chat. But with that said, can you guys give us at least 3 points so our parents, community members can take back home and be able to, digest all of this and keep them in mind as we move forward, working together to bring equity to all of our schools?
One of the things.
All right, let's choose Dr. Swinney. Go for it.
I started the presentation, so I thought, but he could end it. I will say, first off, equity work is everybody's work. And that as we are also talking with the district, talk to our neighbors, I was in a conversation with the multicultural education policy and talking about race. And there were some parents who just had total different beliefs around what young people should be learning in school, around understanding LGBTQ students, understanding racial identity. And I was like, this is a big task that the district is moving toward, like to take on culturally responsive education. But I think talking to our neighbors about race, there are some tools at equity.cps.edu that I think can be very helpful. So please check us out there. That's my one. And my second, and I'll do two, and Ben can do one or two. My second is to continue to engage with us during community engagement sessions. Like Nicole, I appreciate how you always show up, you ask us good questions, but you always give us good thoughts. And so I want to keep those doors and relationships open, because that's how we get better at the district. And Chicago Public Schools, we're going to continue to live out our commitment to become a more equitable district. That's why we're here. And so I appreciate everybody's questions.
Good thing he went first, because I'm just going to double down on the last point. Folks, once again, I think it's really relevant that like we call out the real enemy of what we're solving for. And it's decades, hundreds of years of systematic racism that we're solving for. And that's why it's so complicated. But what you do have in us, what you have in our district, is you actually have a district that is drinking its Kool-Aid. We are extending the table. And we know that to get to where we need to hear from you. We are listening. We are going to create a number of ways to hear from you. And if we're not doing it the right way, we need to know the best way to do it. And we need your help in actually tapping other folks to get them around the table. And once again, if there's a different way we need to do it, we need to know what that is, because the only way we're going to be pulling together accountability, funding, equity plans that's comprehensive enough to meet all the needs is if we hear from you all and we build it together. I firmly believe we are in a magical time we will be able to do it. But it's only if we hear each other, and right now we're here to listen. So thank you in advance for helping us build it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chief Howell, Dr. Swinney, for being here, Carla for doing the interpretation. Thank you so much for showing that equity matters, that we're working towards it, and that we're gonna hopefully attain it one of these days in the near future. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It is 5 o'clock, where it's 5:02. We appreciate your time. This will be shared on our YouTube channel. We will be emailing everyone who was here tonight to ensure that you guys get all of this information and we don't miss out on this. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. Have a great weekend. Have a great spring break. Be safe. Do social distance. Please wear your mask. Get your vaccine.
All of that.
Let's all work together. I feel like a mom right now. I am a mom. I am a mom. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.